Hey everybody, John, aka The Prepared Mind here. Wanted to do this video for a long time, finally got around to talking about it and putting it together, and here it is. I've had some great videos where I attacked trolls and morons, and surprisingly, normally they don't fight back, they just go away. And also, I guess similarly surprisingly, some stick around for more abuse. But that's not what this particular video is about. And a few of you have decided that, well, maybe it is. Maybe I'm interested in defending myself. In reality, I'm not. What I'm interested in doing is examining critical thinking. The reason I've chosen this subject is because I catch myself from time to time making a bad argument. And similarly, again, I find myself falling for bad arguments. Getting caught by them, getting caught off guard. Most of the time, when I'm faced with a logical fallacy, I get really mad, because they are just asinine in some cases the way they're presented, as if they carry the weight of the Word of God with them, and the person using them really feels clever. So this video isn't about trolls and dipshits, but it's about how we think and how we present ourselves to others. One of the larger questions we have is how we answer people when they ask about shit hitting the fan or conspiracies, and also how those people take what we have to say. Do we make a good argument? Do we debate or trade concepts with people on a rational and logical manner, or do we come off as something else? So I don't want to make those mistakes, and especially when dealing with the authorities. And that's whether I just think about them or I got them right in front of me. I want to know that they aren't tricking me. And I certainly want to make sure they stay in their place, and I use good argument. Good rational debate to keep myself leveled and grounded with them. And I'll admit, as I go through this, I do from time to time mess up. And sometimes I do it intentionally. And you'll get some examples out of me. I'm going to use slides because they're humorous and I like humor. Additionally, they'll be illustrative. Most of the logical fallacies have a Latin name. From time to time I'll attempt to use them, but my Latin, because I don't speak it on a daily basis, is a little bit rustic. So forgive me for my improper pronunciations or my tongue tripping. So let's get down to it. What is a logical fallacy? It's just a really big question we all have. I'm going to do my best to talk about all of the fallacies out there, and then try and cover some ways to think using common sense. I think Thomas Paine wrote a book called Common Sense back during the American Revolution, or just prior to it. And he was particularly disgusted with the lack of it, even back then. So I imagine he is spinning in his grave and not getting any rest, knowing the plight and condition of the human mind today. Anyways, I'm trying to make this list exhaustive without being exhausting to learn about. I'm hoping that the quality of this video will make it a reference work for those of us who want to understand good argument and the way the human mind works. And I also firmly believe that people have been indoctrinated and brainwashed in schools and by TV to fall for, to be ensnared by logical fallacies. And it's also my opinion that once they're learned, they use them on people they know, unwittingly, unknowingly. And a lot of times they can be effective, but once you can see through them, they're not effective at all. They're very poor ways to conduct conversation or debate. And helping people see them, I think, is going to be very important. And that's the purpose of this video, is to learn about them. So let's start off with a big one. It's called the ad hominem. And it's attacking your opponent's character or personal traits instead of engaging with their argument. Ad hominem attacks can take the form of overtly attacking somebody or more subtly casting doubt on their character. The result of an ad hom attack can be to undermine someone without actually having to engage in their argument. Here's an example. After Sally presents an eloquent and compelling case for a more equitable taxation system, Sam asked the audience whether we should believe anything from a woman who isn't married, was once arrested, and smells a bit weird. That's an ad hominem attack. And I'm going to use some of these football pictures in here also that you'll be seeing because they're funny, right? If you attack the opponent instead of their argument, that's an ad hominem attack. One is an attack, and then there's also the fallacy. An example of the ad hominem fallacy would be, you're wrong because you're ugly. But an attack is just, you're wrong and you're ugly. In either case, it's to destroy the man, to go after the man and not their argument. It's very common. And from time to time I'll do them just because I am completely pissed off at somebody and they've attacked me, so I'll attack them back. Not the best form on my part, I understand, but hey, we're all trying to learn. But the ad hominem attack, a lot of times people will do them because they have no good answer to the information you're presenting them. And when we're talking about shitting the fan and conspiracy theories, yeah, people just jump up and say, that's, you're stupid, right? Conspiracies are stupid, and you're stupid for saying them. And they attack you and call you stupid, or idiotic, or demented. And they're attacking you instead of examining the information. And another great example of how to use an ad hominem attack in a different kind of way is known as poisoning the well. And that would be preemptively attacking somebody by saying, well, they're unmarried, they've been arrested, and they smell a bit weird. So why would you want to believe the argument they're making, which is X? And so poisoning the well is talking bad about somebody preemptively so that no one will consider their information, or hopefully no one would consider their information. A very sneaky type of ad hominem attack, but very popular. Another great logical fallacy is to appeal to the authority of others. And that's falsely assuming that an expert is infallible or incapable of being wrong. Everyone loves to quote the smartest people they know, or people with degrees like doctors or lawyers, people that have been elected to high positions, politicians and presidents. They want you to believe them because they are authority figures or recognized authority figures, when in fact the information presented by that person or that opinion may have no weight at all, or that person's argument may have no weight at all, even though they're a doctor or a lawyer or a scientist or what have you. Some great early examples of how the logical fallacies were used in advertising came from tobacco companies, where they would say things like, more doctors prefer, take your pick, Pell-Mells, Marlboros, Camels, Lucky Strikes. 4 out of 5 doctors prefer Lucky Strike to give them the pickup they need. Refreshing and healthy. Whatever they're saying about it, they'll borrow the credibility of somebody else to make their case. Or they'll borrow someone else's lines and then credit it to them. Sort of the opposite of the appeal to authority is the lack of authority argument, that, well, you have no credentials, or that's not your field of expertise, so you cannot argue about it. You can't bring that to the debate floor because you aren't recognized as an authority, or you have no degree, etc., etc. It's the opposite of the appeal to authority. It's the rejected because of no authority. Very common, and it's one I fought against a long time, and that particular argument drove me to educate myself and get degrees. And I went back to those same people to finish the discussion, and guess what? They came up with another ridiculous logical fallacy in which to dismiss the argument from their mind altogether. I didn't waste my time in getting the degrees or the information, but I did waste my time in the argument with the moron. All right. One of my all-time favorites, attempted guilt by association, right? Just because two items share one trait does not mean they share all traits, right? Guilt by association. Very, very popular, very easy to see, and it works quite well in debates, by the way. Guilt by association. Obama has several traits which are very, very similar to Adolf Hitler. Right? They both don't like guns, they don't like this, they don't like that. Therefore, one is the other. You're guilt by association. Not a good thing. Not a good debate tactic, but a dirty trick that works. Okay. When it comes to tradition, it's very much like appealing to authority. Argumentum ad absurdum, right? The appeal is that we've always done it that way, so it must be right. That's the appeal to tradition or custom. It's a shallow argument. If you look at the picture I have here of the Spaniard running from the bulls. Okay. Tradition. Yeah, it's tradition to run in front of the bulls. That's what they do. But to make the argument that makes it right or a good thing to do or whatever, it's just silly. Anyway, logical fallacy. We've always done it that way. It must be right. We're not going to change now because that is our custom. It's customary for us to do this thing, this X. And the proper name for it is the argumentum ad antiquitatem. And again, it's been a long day and lots of fun. It's a logical fallacy in which a thesis is deemed correct on the basis that it correlates with some past or present tradition. A favorite to use is an appeal to emotions. And that's a broad category. Because there's lots of different emotions. Love, pity, fear, hatred, envy, pride. It's an attempt to manipulate an emotional response out of the people you're arguing with. And they'll do that instead of providing a compelling argument or response. One of the best ones, and the example is at the bottom, is having to do with food. You need to finish your food on your plate because there are starving kids in China or Africa, and they don't have any food. That's appealing to the emotion of the child, right? They're trying to get you to pity those other kids and do something, and it actually has no logical place, right? It's just appealing to emotion. Here's a letter. Dear Sir, as a mother of 9 children, I would like to speak out on the draft everyone is talking about. I am one that is very much against it. I lost a husband in Korea, and if they draft from age 18 to 26, I stand to lose 4 sons and 1 daughter. As a mother in poor health, I don't think I could take that. Why can't Carter leave well enough alone and try and find some of our boys still missing or being held in some place? I don't know if that was really written back in 1980, but that letter is an appeal to emotion fallacy that incorporates many things. the single mother in poor health, pity, right? It brings up fear and anger. It's just a great letter to illustrate the logical fallacy that is the appeal to emotions. When someone you're debating with is losing, or they're not wanting to come to your side, but at least they're recognizing the argument, they'll engage in what's known as moderation, or a run to the middle ground, and saying that a compromise or a middle point between two arguments must be the truth, right? Much of the time the truth does indeed lie between 2 points, but this can bias thinking, right? The compromise can take a true thing and make it untrue. Some people will use that just to get you to back off, or they'll save face with it, or ask to save face. It's just it's kind of a spineless it's kind of a spineless logical fallacy. Who likes moderates? I don't know. Anyways, a great logical fallacy is the appeal to popularity. 2,000 Kool-Aid drinkers can't be wrong, can they? Well, of course they can. 9 out of 10 doctors prefer Marlboros. That's an appeal to popularity among recognized authority figures. Right? That's kind of a twofer. In fact, while we're talking about that, combining different logical fallacies together can be very, very powerful. Let me make one up here. 9 out of 10 doctors agree that Marlboros are the best cigarette, and if you disagree with them, then you're a moron. That's an ad hominem attack followed by an appeal to authority and popularity. There's 3 things there, and the more of those that are combined, I've watched and seen this happen, the more confused people get, and the more they will submit to that authority, that presumed authority in speech. The logical fallacy, one atop another. It's very confusing to the mind. And I've got to say this, if 50 million people believe in a fallacy, it is still a fallacy. Right? Fallacy can be a lie. If 50 million people believe a lie, it's still a lie. And our parents used to illustrate this one to us, and I think in a very correct way. You get in trouble for doing something, and then your parent says, if your brother ran and jumped off a bridge, would you? If all your friends jumped off that bridge, would you? Right? They're appealing to logical thinking. And that is to say that just because everyone else believes it and did it, doesn't make it a good idea. Yay moms everywhere for coming up with that one. And very similar to the appeal to popularity is the bandwagon. Okay? It's also called the bandwagon. Well, everyone else is doing it. Get on the bandwagon. That doesn't make it right or smart or a good argument. Right? Everyone else thinks it's a good idea, so you should too. Not necessarily true. One of my favorites is the special pleading. The special pleading logical fallacy. I also call it the divine fallacy, because the rule applies to everyone except there's a miracle that's happened. And that when a miracle occurs, someone gets a special case. So humans have an aversion to being wrong, and so you move the goalposts. You make up an exception when your claim is shown to be false or the argument is false. So here's an example. Edward Johns claimed to be a psychic, but when his abilities were tested under proper scientific conditions, They disappeared. Edward explained this, saying that one had to have faith in his abilities for them to work. So either you have a special exemption, or there's a special thing expected of everyone else in order for that argument to be correct. A real-world example I could use there is everywhere that Newton is wrong, then Einstein is correct. And everywhere that Einstein and everyone else is wrong, then the special theory of relativity was created. No one really understands that garbage. And what it does is it creates an exception. And they combine that with a couple other fallacies in order to confuse people. Now, I'm sure there's a mathematician out there that's going to tell me that the theory of relativity and the special theory are true and they can be proven mathematically. Well, I'm going to argue that that doesn't really matter. They are used to make exceptions to rules that were formerly impossible to disprove. So, creating your own language just to fool people or trick them with a logical fallacy is just, it makes no sense. Alrighty, ambiguity, great logical fallacy. There can be double meanings to words, or using words that sound very similar. Ambiguity of language is used to mislead or misrepresent the truth. Politicians are terrific at this. So are scientists and mathematicians. They can be very ambiguous. And when you think you've got them cornered, they can say things like, well, that's not what I meant. This is what I meant. Right? It is... it's a very aggravating type of logical fallacy to deal with, because you're chasing the meaning of words with someone, like using a an illegal hominin situation, as in the joke illustration. They'll change the meaning of a word or the word that they used. And what comes to mind is, if you can't dazzle them with your brilliance, you baffle them with your bullshit. And that leads us to proof by verbosity. Okay? By using words and phrases and not being quiet, right, and just talking over people. That's verbosity and bullshit. And that's one that you're going to see, and it's hard to beat. And when you see people playing these types of games in debate or an argument, you know that you're dealing with someone who has very poor arguments. Otherwise, they would make them. They would have that Perry Mason moment where they jump up and they say, gotcha, because this is the way it is, and they would say a truth. Instead, they use a fallacy to distract you or to distract the argument. All right, Adolf Hitler, make the lie big, make it simple, keep saying it, eventually they will believe it. Right? A lie told often enough becomes the truth, says Lenin. And here's a picture which is great, in itself a fallacy. It's a substitution fallacy, and a couple others all tied into one. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it, says Dr. Joseph Goebbels, and it's a picture of Obama. Right? Guilt by association used with some verbosity. It's used that way. Those are, again, combined fallacies are very powerful. And that brings us to one that just drives me ape shit when I'm having a discussion or trying to answer commentary on these videos on YouTube, is circular logic. And it's an argument that has no supporting evidence other than its own claim. The primitive fossil is primitive because it was found in an old rock. Well, how do you know it's an old rock? Because the primitive fossil was found in it. That's an example of a scientific circular reasoning argument. And it's important to know that Rule 1, science is always right because science is never wrong. And then Rule 2 is Rule 1, right? Rule 1 is circular reasoning. It's always right because it's never wrong. And you're like, well, where's your evidence? Well, I don't need it because I'm always right. Okay. The loaded question, the dirty trick of dirty tricks. Right? You ask a question that has a presumption built into it so that it can't be answered without giving the appearance of guilt or wrongdoing. Here it is. So, Fred, when did you quit beating your wife? If you answer the question, last week, last month, last year, you just admitted to beating your wife, right? And if you just sit there and silently say, I'm not going to answer that stupid question, then you appear guilty because you haven't answered the question, which is presumptive. It's a loaded question. Dirty, dirty trick, and occasionally I've used them just to put people in a corner and beat up on them. Not very nice, I know that. Okay, this is similar. It is the appeal to genetics. Judging something good or bad on the basis of where it comes from or from whom it comes. Here's an example. Accused on the 6 o'clock news of corruption and taking bribes, the senator said that we should all be very wary of the things we hear in the media because we all know how very unreliable the media can be. That is an attack on the pedigree, as it were, of the media. Now, this is where I'm going to back up and say that is an appeal to genetics and an ad hominem attack, the example I just read. Now, you can use that argument if you use evidence to support it, but you can't just come out and baldly state it. You would have to say something like, the news reporter Fred, oh no, let's go and have fun with Brian Williams. He's an even better example. Brian Williams lied about his activities relating to the war. And because he lied so bald-facedly and about something so important, nobody is going to accept his word as reliable. So every news story that he's ever said is going to be looked at, suspiciously. That's not attacking him because he's part of the mass media. That is stating facts and using evidence to support your argument. As long as you have evidence to support what you're saying, you can make it. Here's a big one, and you'll even hear the phrase when people have arguments: begging the question. It is a circular argument in which the conclusion is included in the premise. Okay. Begging the question. The word of Zorbo the Great is flawless and perfect. We know this because it says so in the great and infallible book of Zorbo's best and most truest things. Okay, begging the question. It begs the question. Okay, the Texas sharpshooter. And this is you cherry-picked a data cluster to suit your argument or found a pattern to fit a presumption. Okay, the logical fallacy here is that it appears the person making the argument is really hitting the mark. They're picking on a very small item, and it doesn't necessarily indicate that the other person's argument is wrong, but rather they're being discredited. And here's an example. The makers of Sugarette candy drinks point to research showing that of the 5 countries where Sugarette drinks set the most units, or sell the most units, right, 3 of them are in the top 10 healthiest countries on earth. Therefore, Sugarette drinks are healthy. Okay, they pulled out some data or some research to support their argument, right? But it really has nothing to do with the argument. Okay, but it's picking some information that would support it, and if someone wasn't paying attention, they can get caught by this. Okay. In time is something we deal with when we argue or debate or have conversations. I have so many comments on so many videos, I can't keep up with them all, right? There comes a point where I say the debate is continued past its logical conclusion. While that's not necessarily true, a lot of people will say, I don't have time for this shit, right? They're on the losing side. One of the claims is, I don't have time. And sometimes people will continue to argue illogical or logical fallacies to the point where you say, you haven't answered the question I have. You keep coming up with bullshit. And so the debate is continued past its logical conclusion. You've failed. Sometimes those things happen very close to the end because one or both sides become aggravated with the argument. Composition and division. Okay, there's a couple of names for this. The whole for its parts is another name. And you assume that one part of something has to be applied to all or other parts of it, or that the whole must apply to its parts. Okay. Often when something is true for the part, it does apply to the whole, or vice versa. I'm going to give a quick example, and then you'll understand. You can't possibly believe the scientific evidence provided by Detective Sherlock Holmes's testimony. Detective Sherlock Holmes has zero social skills and once admitted to a moment of drug use in college. I believe Sherlock Holmes was a fan of cocaine. Anyways, you're expected to dismiss the information because the part that was discussed, and that is that Sherlock Holmes has no social skills. Well, that has nothing to do with the argument, but it's used, a part of him is used to dismiss the entirety of his presence or his being in that argument. All right, let me try this example. Daniel was a precocious child and had a liking for logic. He reasoned that atoms are invisible, and that he was made of atoms, and therefore he was invisible too. Right, that was the sum of one part applied to the all. And so that's an interesting way to illustrate how parts don't equal the whole, and the whole isn't the parts. Right? The whole can't be taken care of for the parts. And similar to this is the fallacy. And that is that it's presumed that because a claim has been poorly argued, or a fallacy or mistake has been made, that the entire claim or argument itself must be wrong. This is a trap that I fall in oftentimes. Well, that guy lied, so should I believe anything he says? Now, when I can take a look at a subject matter, a group, an individual, or an organization, and I can make the same claim across many, many arguments, then I can say, well, they lie. In this case, I'm going to cite NASA. It can be demonstrated by examining the evidence of the NASA Apollo missions that they have lied consistently for decades about the space program. So therefore, I will say that anything they say at this point has to be examined because it's likely a lie until it can be proven correct. That is how I avoid the fallacy. But it is incorrect to jump right into an argument and say, well, that person, they made a mistake, or they're not making a great argument, so therefore the entire premise of their argument is wrong. That's dismissing it, right, out of hand because of a small mistake. Quite different from someone like NASA lying continually. This is a great one, the anecdotal fallacy. You use a personal experience or an isolated example to prove an argument or make an argument instead of a sound argument or compelling evidence. Here's an example. Jason said that he was all cool and everything, but his grandfather smoked 30 cigarettes a day and he lived until 97. So don't believe anything you read about the danger of cigarettes. right? That's anecdotal, and that is that you pick one person that you know of, right, and then you use that example to support an argument, and it has no place in it, right? It's limited, it's isolated. Okay. Another great one is false analogy. A misleading comparison between two ideas that are not alike in all aspects. Okay. False analogy is, first off, someone has to know how to use analogies, but typically these mistakes are made by people who don't. Okay. In sport, as in war, there is no substitute for victory. Football coaches, I guess, love things like this. Sport isn't war. It's not life or death. It's a game. So therefore, comparing the two things through analogy is erroneous, right? It's a false, it's a logical fallacy. It's false. It's not true. So comparing two things that are not really comparable through analogy is very, very wrong. I need to be careful of that. Black or white. You present two alternatives and basically state them as the only possibilities, right? When in fact more may exist. And it's the this or that, the black or white argument. I also call that the false dilemma. In an example, one of them is capitalism is private ownership of property, and socialism is state ownership of human beings. Pick one. You know, that's this guy's his little banner, his billboard. Are those really the only two choices I have, capitalism and socialism? You know, but that's a black and white logical fallacy. I don't like either of those. I like this concept called freedom. Right? That's not what capitalism is. Certainly not the way it's practiced in America today. But that's how they're presenting it. You know, pick one or the other. And then improperly defining terms. I think we've talked about that one. You know, false dichotomy, black or white. And if and then. The if and then logical fallacy. Yes, if you are successful, then you are more likely to own a laptop, right? And if you own a laptop, then you are successful. Not necessarily true. So the if-then argument, correlation and causation, they may or may not, right, be true, be together, be equal. And so the confusion arises from the presentation angle that is used. The post hoc ergo propter hoc. I washed my car, then it started raining. Clearly, I caused it to rain. You know, that's a correlation equals causation a little more closely, or of a different flavor. Okay, the is-ought argument. And these are all a little different. Sometimes I think I see a lot of one type of fallacy in another. And I'm sure you do as well. There's an is-ought on the last play, says the ref. Player falsely assumed the status quo is the correct answer to the discussion. Right? The rooster crowed, the sun came up. Therefore, rooster and sun are, synonymous in activity. I took the pill and got better. Therefore, it was the pill that made me better. It's a logical fallacy. You got to be careful of that type of thinking. It can lead you down a road that's not good. And here's a great joke on that, right? This is the reductio ad Hitlerum, right? Hitler was a vegetarian, therefore all vegetarians are evil. Pardon me. This is a dirty trick. Logical fallacy, the burden of proof. It's kind of like the appeal to authority, and I said there's an appeal to that you are not authoritative, saying that so this is similar to that one, and that the burden of proof lies not with the person making the claim, but with someone else to disprove it. When they put the burden of proof on you to say, you prove it, right? The burden of proof lies with someone who's making a claim. The inability or disinclination to disprove a claim doesn't make it valid. Let's read the example. Bertrand declares that a teapot is, at this very moment, in orbit around the sun between the Earth and Mars, and that because no one can prove him wrong, his claim is therefore a valid one. That's about the same thing as saying no one has ever disproved a flying spaghetti monster, therefore they must be real. The burden of proof, a lack of evidence, is not evidence. So you can't base an argument or claim to have proven anything because of burden of proof or a lack of evidence, also known as the argument from silence. One of the things that drives me apeshit when it comes to discussion and argument is the non sequitur. And here's a quick little example. 2 is a number and 1 is a number, so 2 equals 1. Right? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow. One is numbers and math and the other is verbiage. Right? Attempting to link 2 points that have nothing to do with each other. Right? Spaghettis and car tires. They have nothing to do with each other. You can't even put them in the same sentence and try and make a point. Doesn't make any sense at all. Which leads me to another joke, the argumentum ad spaghetti. It's a kind of a non sequitur joke. An argument so convoluted that no path between thesis and conclusion can be identified. This one's a bit funny. And no true Scotsman, the logical fallacy. It's an appeal to some form of purity as a way to dismiss relevant criticism or flaws or points in an argument. Angus, we're going to pick a Scots name, right? A Scotch name. Angus declares that Scotsmen do not put sugar in their porridge. And so Angus would yell that no true Scotsman sugars his porridge, and that's his argument. And it's an appeal to, right, purity as a way to argue. It's quite ridiculous. And there's a few other things that are similar to that in the realm of logical fallacies. One of them, I guess, would be the there's so many of these, it's hard to keep them straight. The argument of incredulity, but we'll get to that one as well. This is one of my favorites. I used to do this in 6th grade, and my teacher would say, "John, that's a red herring. What are you doing? That is, the red herring. What does it have to do with anything?" It has to do with relevance to the argument, changing the subject, bringing up something that has absolutely nothing to do with the matter at hand. So this one is kind of interesting. You could look at any one of those things and say, what is it doing in the argument? What does heart disease have to do with HIV deaths? What does HIV deaths have to do with firearm-related deaths or motor vehicle accidents? And so the arguments, it's just basically red herring, throwing information out there, changing the subject. Now this is one that is very difficult to avoid, and it is known as the slippery slope logical fallacy, asserting that if we allow A to happen, then B and C and D will all happen because of it. Let's read the example, which is actually quite poignant. Colin asserts that if we allow same-sex couples to marry, then the next thing we know, we'll all be allowing people to marry their parents, their cars, and monkeys. The slippery slope. If this happens, then this next thing will happen. You know, if we register our guns, then the next thing you know, they're going to confiscate them. That is the slippery slope argument. Now, just like many other forms of argument, if you have information that suggests, in the form of evidence, that what you are saying is true, then you can use it. You know, in the case of, let's just stick with firearms, registering firearms. There are examples in history where politicians have required, through law, through statute, the registration of firearms, and then they confiscated them. And the other part of bolstering an argument with evidence so that it doesn't become a slippery slope fallacy is to bring up the information that people themselves have stated. You know, the United Nations doesn't like guns in the hands of private citizens, private people. And they have stated that in their writing. So when they say, oh, this international rule or law on firearm registration, it won't affect the sovereignty of your nation, the United States of America, when in fact they have always used their power to enforce their will and their law in other countries. So if they were to ask for firearm registration, the UN, through some rule, it is definitely not a slippery slope argument, but can be, there's additional evidence, their own stated anti-gun attitude and their behavior in the past about taking a rule that they said doesn't apply and then making it apply and going further with it. Very tricky. But to hide behind a slippery slope argument is not a good move, because people tend to believe those arguments very readily, even without evidence. So using them is tricky, and if I'm going to use the slippery slope argument, I tend to look for data, supporting evidence or information. Now, straw man. This is a great one. By exaggerating, misrepresenting, or fabricating someone else's argument, it's much easier to present your own position as being valid. Okay, here's an example. After Will said that we should put more money into health and education, Warren responded by saying that he was surprised that Will hates our country so much and that he wants to leave it defenseless by cutting military spending. You know, it's a straw man. It's setting someone else up and then discrediting them or bringing their credibility into question in order to make your argument look more positive, or exaggerate the good qualities of your argument. Okay. The appeal to ignorance, aka hasty generalization. No one has proved X is true, conclusion X is false, That's an appeal to ignorance. But a hasty generalization is specific cases versus a general rule. You can talk about, let's pick on somebody here. Germans, right? Some Germans were Nazis, but not all Nazis were German. Okay, you can't pick on Germans because some of them became Nazis at some point in history. So if someone said, "Hey, that guy's German," you would say the hasty generalization would be, "Well, you know those Germans, they're Nazis." Well, that's a hasty generalization, Shooting from the hip. In specific cases, some Germans were Nazis, but as a general rule, they were not. Hasty generalization. Another great example is a person walking through a town who's a stranger, meets a few polite kids, and his conclusion is that all kids in that town are polite. How many times have we discussed hasty generalizations about shit hitting the fan scenarios and how things will change? And this is a great, it's almost, it's a joke on the logical fallacy. It's, all sweeping generalizations are wrong. Self-explanatory. This is one I have a little trouble with. Tu quoque. Right? You too is what it means. You avoided having to engage with criticism by turning it back on the accuser. You answered criticism with criticism. It's responding to criticism by accusing the other person of the same error. Now, that doesn't absolve you of your mistake, but you just pointed out that somebody else has made a mistake. I do this, or tend to do something like it, because I cannot stand hypocrites. I fucking hate hypocrites. And when someone accuses me of something, I tend to point to them and say, you too. Who are you to point the finger at me? Now, if someone said you're a murderer, and I said, well, you are too, that's not what I'm saying I am. I didn't murder anybody. But when someone says, wow, you belong to a group with mysterious roots, and I don't like it, and I can say, well, you belong to a group with mysterious roots also, and they're not necessarily the best things. And I would point to them and say, you too. I didn't answer the criticism and say, well, wait a minute, as a Freemason, there's not any evidence, that I agree with that says they're engaged in a world conspiracy. And then go to point out who does engage in world conspiracy and who really does have the power. That would be a better answer to the logical fallacy of tu quoque. But sometimes I just do it just because I don't like hypocrites. It's easy to point that out. So, when we realize and recognize that there's a lot of logical fallacies out there, and that we don't want to be ensnared by them given to other people, and it's really not a good practice to get into, because smarter and more clever people will catch you and point them out, and then you get stuck holding the bag, looking ridiculous for having made that kind of argument. So, how should we think? How do we use common sense, right? Logic, rhetoric, and grammar, known as the trivium. Okay, it's part of the scientific method: input, processing, output. Right? Knowledge, understanding, and then wisdom with rhetoric, or speaking intelligently about those things. That's what thinking is all about. And there's the all-seeing eye in this right here, right? That's the trivium, the all-seeing eye. That must show what a trick this is that John's using, right? Well, you look at this example right here. This is the trivium expressed through this organization's symbols. They got some Latin letters, some symbology in there. It says logic, rhetoric, and grammar around the seal. That's the Summit Christian Academy. So I'm going to have fun with a little bit of you too on this and say, hey, that kind of thinking isn't just for Freemasons and secret organizations. It is about thinking, period. Thinking clearly, making sound, reasonable arguments, right? Using methodology in critical thinking to come to accurate and clear conclusions and make clear and bright and concise arguments and debate. And I would invite you to research the trivium. You won't be wrong for it, right? It leads you to a proper understanding. I won't go into a diatribe here because I've tortured you almost an hour already. But our schools do not teach how to think anymore. My schools didn't. They teach, or they give you information and then have you memorize it. And they give you conclusions, and they tie things together and explain things, but they do not teach thinking. I'm 46, and I can't imagine that schools today are any better at teaching thinking. That is, logical processes, like the trivium, which teach you how to think and process, how to use common sense, how to build a sound argument within your mind that you can explain verbally or in writing and use to form conclusions that make sense. So I invite you to look into that. I invite you to look at critical thinking, period, and how it's taught. And it is taught in colleges. I guess if you look hard enough, you'll find it. And you would think that before someone hits the age of 20, they would actually teach critical thinking, but they don't. Schools today are indoctrination warehouses and babysitters, where kids are sent while parents work, and the state teaches them what they want them to know and to believe and think the way the state wants them to believe and think. And left to our own devices, it is very difficult for the human mind to work out, right? To work out proper thinking. Information isn't key. Right? Facts aren't key. Right? It takes the entire mind applied to the information at hand to create logical thinking, common sense, critical thinking, to understand the truth. Alright, well, I want to thank you once again for playing with me. And once again, this isn't about beating up on trolls, but it certainly will help you spot them a lot sooner. And if you don't want to argue with people, if you catch somebody continuously using these, point out that they're being illogical. Point out that they're using fallacies as part of their argument. And if they don't want to listen to that, or if they say, well, that's how I argue, well, then it's not worth your time. And I guess I hear that a lot when people say, John, why are you battling with that troll, or why are you attacking those trolls? Don't waste your time. I agree, and usually when I pick on trolls, it's because I feel like it, and I just want to do some screaming and ranting and yelling and raving. They don't really get under my skin a whole lot. And every now and then I'll argue with them just to see how stupid they can be. Just to get them to continue to say the stupidest things. Circular reasoning is huge. Ad hominem attacks are huge. If-then, rhetoric is used quite often. All these fallacies I've seen and heard. And quite frankly, if you engage with somebody who can't find any avenue of approach to critical thinking by which they can get there, they're not worth your time or my time. And I've started a little something with my videos now, and that's if you make it to the end of the video, I'm going to give you a code word. The code word. What do we want to use for the code word? Oh, let's use the code word level. L-E-V-E-L. If you leave a comment and use the word level in it, right? Like any way you want, level, L-E-V-E-L, then I'll know you watched the entire video. Alright, chance favors the prepared mind, and I try not to leave anything to chance. Take care, Godspeed, Semper Fi. Prepared Mind wishing you a good night. I can't believe that I actually forgot personal incredulity. I mentioned it once briefly, then I committed it in describing the education system, or at least my opinion of it, and I wanted to touch on it a bit. And basically it's saying that because one finds something difficult to understand, that it's therefore not true. Example, Kirk drew a picture of a fish and a human, and with effusive disdain asked Richard if he really thought he was stupid enough to believe that a fish somehow turned into a human. The argument isn't, the incredulity really doesn't have anything to do with evolution, but rather his unwillingness to think about it, or his unwillingness to accept it. His personal outrage at the mere thought of an idea is to have incredulity towards it. It's very common. I run into it all the time. You expect me to believe that? That's a pretty common phrase. Or here's another cute, quaint one that's used now, and it's one word: please. Are you kidding me? You're going to use one word, please, to describe your incredulity and try to discredit my evidence, my argument, my debate, right? My proofs? Please. Oh, come on. Anyways, that's personal incredulity. It is a favorite of mine to watch people try and use. Because they say, okay, now that you've been personally offended by something we're discussing and you have no good argument, have you come up with a good argument in the time that you've spent morally objecting to what I'm trying to discuss? All right, enough on that. Take care. Bye-bye.